Every night at exactly 11:47 p.m., the whispers begin. They seep through the walls of cell 13 at Blackmoor Asylum, carrying words that should have been silenced forever. The cell has been empty for 3 years, its heavy iron door sealed shut after the last patient was transferred. Yet the voices persist, speaking in hushed, desperate tones about experiments that never should have happened. Margaret Blackwood, night shift nurse, has heard these whispers for months, and tonight she's finally going to discover what they're trying to tell her. Before we delve deeper into the horrifying secrets of Blackmoor Asylum, I want to ask you something. If you're brave enough to hear this story through to its chilling conclusion, please subscribe to Dark Heritage Files and hit that notification bell. We bring you the darkest mysteries that most channels wouldn't dare touch. Also, I'm curious, from which city and country are you listening to us tonight? Let me know in the comments below. Your support helps us uncover more forbidden stories like this one. What you're about to hear has been pieced together from fragmented records, whispered accounts from former staff, and the personal journal of Margaret Blackwood herself. The truth about what happened in cell 13 was buried for good reason, but some secrets refuse to stay hidden. In the autumn of 1895, Blackmoor Asylum stood like a fortress of despair on the outskirts of Rochester, New York. The imposing brick structure housed over 300 patients, its Gothic towers piercing the grey October sky like accusing fingers. The asylum had been built 30 years earlier, during the height of the mental health reform movement, when well-meaning reformers believed that proper treatment could cure any form of madness. Margaret Blackwood had worked the night shift at Blackmoor for 7 years. At 32, she was considered an old maid by society's standards, but her unmarried status allowed her the freedom to pursue a career that most women wouldn't dare consider. She was known for her methodical approach to patient care and her unflinching dedication to her duties, even when those duties led her into the asylum's darkest corners. The asylum was divided into 5 wings, each housing patients according to their diagnosed conditions. The East Wing held the melancholic women, the West Wing housed the violent men, and the North Wing contained what the staff euphemistically called special cases, patients whose conditions required experimental treatments. Cell 13 was located in the basement of the North Wing, in a section that had been sealed off 3 years earlier following the mysterious disappearance of Dr. Silas Blackmoor, the asylum's former head physician. Dr. Blackmoor had been a pioneer in what he called advanced psychiatric intervention. He arrived at the asylum in 1888 with impressive credentials from European medical institutions and a reputation for achieving remarkable results with the most difficult cases. The asylum's board of directors had given him unprecedented freedom to develop new treatment protocols, believing that his methods might finally provide cures for conditions that had long been considered hopeless. The staff whispered that Dr. Blackmoor worked strange hours, often remaining in the North Wing until dawn. Deliveries of unusual equipment arrived regularly: copper wiring, glass cylinders, and mechanical devices that no one could identify. When asked about his methods, Blackmoor would only say that he was documenting the true nature of mental affliction and that his work would revolutionize the understanding of the human mind. On the night of September 15, 1892, everything changed. Margaret was making her rounds when she heard screaming coming from the North Wing. Not the usual cries of distressed patients, but something different. These were screams of terror so pure and desperate that they seemed to claw at the very air. When she rushed toward the sound, she found Dr. Blackmoor standing in the corridor outside cell 13, his white coat stained with what looked like blood. "There's been an accident," he told her, his hands trembling as he locked the cell door. "Patient 47 has had a severe reaction to the treatment. I need you to ensure that no one enters this wing tonight. No one. Do you understand?" Margaret nodded, though something in the doctor's eyes made her stomach turn. She had seen patient 47, a young woman named Sarah Coleman, who had been committed by her husband for what he claimed was religious hysteria. Sarah had always seemed lucid to Margaret, speaking coherently about her children and expressing a desperate desire to return home. The next morning, Dr. Blackmoor announced that patient 47 had died during the night from complications related to her mental condition. There would be no autopsy, he declared, as the patient's family had requested immediate burial. When Margaret asked to see the death certificate, Blackmoor's response was swift and cold. "Your concerns are noted, Miss Blackwood, but patient records are confidential medical matters." Indeed, but Margaret had been keeping her own unofficial records. She had noticed that over the past year, several patients assigned to Dr. Blackmoor's care had simply vanished from the asylum's rolls. When she inquired about these disappearances, she was told that the patients had been transferred to other facilities or had died from their conditions. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. 3 days after patient 47's death, Dr. Blackmoor himself disappeared. He simply failed to arrive for his morning rounds, and when the asylum's director investigated, they found his office cleared of all personal effects. His experimental equipment remained, but all of his patient files had been removed. The board of directors made a swift decision to seal the North Wing basement indefinitely, claiming that structural concerns made the area unsafe. The years that followed Dr. Blackmoor's disappearance were marked by an eerie calm. The North Wing basement remained sealed, and the asylum settled into a routine that seemed almost normal. But Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had been left unfinished. She began experiencing nightmares about Cell 13, dreams filled with muffled voices and the sound of mechanical devices whirring in the darkness. It was during the winter of 1894 that Margaret first heard the whispers. She was conducting her nightly rounds when a faint sound drew her attention toward the sealed section of the North Wing. At first, she thought it might be mice or settling building materials, but as she pressed her ear to the sealed door, she realized she was hearing human voices. The whispers were barely audible, but they seemed to follow a pattern. Every night at 11:47 p.m., they would begin, soft, urgent voices speaking in fragments that she couldn't quite understand. Margaret began keeping a journal of what she heard, writing down every word she could make out. The phrases were disturbing. "Please don't make me say it again. My children need me. I'm not insane." And most chillingly, "He's recording everything." Margaret's supervisor, head nurse Catherine Morrison, dismissed her concerns as the product of an overactive imagination combined with too many years of night shift work. "The human mind can play tricks," Morrison told her. "You're hearing the building settling, nothing more." But Margaret knew what she was hearing, and she was determined to find out what was causing it. She began researching Dr. Blackmoor's background, spending her days off at the Rochester Public Library and corresponding with medical institutions where he had claimed to work. What she discovered was troubling. Several of the credentials on Blackmoor's resume were fabricated, and the European institutions he claimed to have studied at had no record of him. More disturbing still, she found newspaper accounts from other cities describing the mysterious disappearances of doctors matching Blackmoor's description, always following investigations into questionable patient deaths. Margaret's investigation led her to contact the families of patients who had vanished during Dr. Blackmoor's tenure. What she learned shattered her understanding of the asylum's mission. Many of the so-called mentally ill patients had been committed not because of genuine psychiatric conditions, but because they had become inconvenient to their families. Sarah Coleman, patient 47, was a perfect example. Margaret discovered that Sarah had been committed by her husband after she threatened to expose his financial misconduct at the bank where he worked. Sarah's medical records, which Margaret managed to access through a sympathetic clerk, showed no evidence of mental illness. Instead, they contained detailed notes about her stubborn refusal to accept her husband's authority and her inappropriate interest in business matters. The pattern became clear as Margaret investigated further. Patient 23, a man named Thomas Hartwell, had been committed after discovering that his brother was embezzling from their family's shipping business. Patient 31, a young woman named Eleanor Pierce, had been institutionalized after refusing an arranged marriage to a man 40 years her senior. These weren't mentally ill individuals. They were inconvenient people whose families had found a legal way to silence them permanently. But Margaret's most disturbing discovery concerned the Whispers themselves. During her research, she learned that Dr. Blackmoor had been experimenting with a new invention, Edison's phonograph. The Asylum's purchasing records, which she accessed during a brief visit to the administrative offices, showed that Blackmoor had ordered multiple phonographic devices, along with hundreds of wax cylinders for recording. The implications were horrifying. If Blackmoor had been using phonographic equipment in Cell 13, and if the whispers she was hearing were actually recordings, then what she was listening to every night were the final words of patients who had died under his care. The thought made her physically ill, but it also gave her a new determination to uncover the truth. Margaret decided that she had to find a way into the sealed basement. She spent weeks observing the night security routines, noting when guards made their rounds and identifying periods when the north wing would be unmonitored. She also began gathering the tools she would need: a crowbar to pry open the sealed door, an oil lamp for light, and most importantly, the courage to face whatever she might find. On the night of October 13th, 1895, Margaret finally made her move. She waited until after midnight, when the asylum settled into its deepest quiet. The security guard was making his rounds in the east wing, giving her approximately 30 minutes before he would return to the north wing. Her hands shook as she approached the sealed door to the basement, the whispers growing louder with each step. The door had been barricaded with wooden planks and sealed with tar, but Margaret had come prepared. She worked quietly but urgently, prying away the boards and scraping off enough tar to access the door handle. As she worked, the whispers seemed to grow more urgent, as if the voices knew that someone was finally coming to find them. When the door finally creaked open, Margaret was hit by a wave of stale air that carried the unmistakable smell of death. Her oil lamp cast dancing shadows on the stone walls as she descended the narrow staircase into the basement. The whispers were much clearer now, and she could make out individual words and phrases. But what chilled her to the bone was the realization that the voices were coming from multiple locations throughout the basement. The basement corridor was lined with cells, each sealed with heavy iron doors, but cell 13 at the end of the corridor stood open. As Margaret approached, she could see that the cell had been converted into some kind of laboratory. Tables lined the walls, covered with strange mechanical devices, glass containers filled with unidentifiable substances, and most disturbing of all, dozens of wax cylinders arranged in neat rows. In the center of the cell sat a large phonographic device, more complex than any she had seen before. Multiple cylinders were mounted on rotating drums, connected by a system of gears and clockwork mechanisms that appeared to be designed to play the recordings in sequence. The device was still operating, its mechanical components moving with the precision of a fine timepiece. Margaret examined the wax cylinders more closely and found that each was labeled with a patient number and date. The dates ranged from late 1888 to September 1892, covering the entire period of Dr. Blackmoor's tenure at the asylum. As she listened, she realized that what she was hearing wasn't random whispers, but actual recorded confessions and final statements from patients who had died in this very cell. Just when we think we've seen it all, the horror in cell 13 intensifies. If this story is giving you the creeps, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Give it a like to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Let's find out together what happens next. Margaret found a leather-bound journal hidden beneath the phonographic equipment, and its contents revealed the full scope of Dr. Blackmoor's horrific experiments. The doctor hadn't been trying to cure mental illness at all. He had been conducting what he called studies in human psychological endurance for wealthy families who wanted to permanently silence inconvenient relatives. The journal detailed a systematic process of psychological torture, designed to break down patients' resistance and force them to confess to various crimes or inappropriate behaviors. Blackmoor would isolate patients in cell 13 for days at a time, subjecting them to sensory deprivation, experimental drugs, and psychological manipulation until they were willing to say anything to make the torment stop. But the most sinister aspect of Blackmoor's operation was his use of the phonographic equipment. He would record these forced confessions, creating permanent evidence that could be used to justify the patient's continued imprisonment, or, in many cases, their deaths. The recordings were then sent to the families who had paid for the treatment, providing them with seemingly legitimate documentation of their relatives' mental instability. Margaret listened in horror as the phonograph played Sarah Coleman's final recording. Sarah's voice, weak and broken, confessed to unnatural thoughts and inappropriate behavior toward her husband, clearly words that had been beaten out of her through weeks of torture. The recording ended with Sarah begging for her life, promising to never speak of her husband's crimes if she could just see her children one more time. The journal revealed that Dr. Blackmoor had recorded the deaths of 47 patients in cell 13. Each recording captured their final moments, creating a grotesque archive of human suffering. The phonographic device had been programmed to play these recordings continuously, cycling through the voices of the dead in an endless loop of testimony to Blackmoor's crimes. Margaret discovered that Blackmoor's disappearance hadn't been voluntary. The journal's final entry, dated September 18, 1892, revealed that he had been confronted by Thomas Hartwell's brother, who had grown suspicious about Thomas's sudden deterioration at the asylum. When the brother threatened to involve the authorities, Blackmoor had panicked and fled, but not before setting the phonograph to continue playing automatically, ensuring that the evidence of his crimes would persist even in his absence. Margaret spent the rest of the night transcribing as much of Blackmoor's journal as she could, documenting the names of patients, the families who had paid for their silence, and the detailed methods of torture that had been employed. As dawn approached, she carefully sealed cell 13 again, but not before taking several of the most incriminating wax cylinders as evidence. Her attempts to bring the truth to light met with immediate and powerful resistance. When she presented her findings to the asylum's board of directors, she was told that the evidence was inadmissible because it had been obtained through unauthorized entry into a sealed area. More troubling still, she learned that several board members had family connections to the wealthy individuals named in Blackmoor's journal. Margaret tried to take her evidence to the local police, but found that the influence of the asylum's benefactors extended deep into Rochester's power structure. Her accusations were dismissed as the delusions of an overworked nurse, and she was warned that continuing to make such claims could result in her own commitment to a psychiatric institution. Frustrated but not defeated, Margaret decided to ensure that the truth would eventually come to light. She made copies of Blackmoor's journal and hid them in various locations throughout Rochester, including the public library and the offices of sympathetic journalists. She also documented the location and operation of the phonographic device, creating detailed instructions for anyone who might someday gain access to cell 13. The whispers continued for 3 more months after Margaret's discovery. Then, on a cold January night in 1896, they suddenly stopped. When Margaret investigated, she found that the phonographic device had finally wound down, its clockwork mechanism exhausted after years of continuous operation. Cell 13 fell silent at last, but the weight of what Margaret had learned continued to haunt her. Margaret Blackwood left Blackmoor Asylum in the spring of 1896, officially citing health concerns, but privately unable to continue working in a place where such horrors had been committed. She moved to Buffalo, where she worked at a small community hospital until her retirement. She never married, dedicating her life to ensuring that the vulnerable patients in her care were treated with dignity and respect. The asylum itself closed permanently in 1923, officially due to changing approaches to mental health treatment. But those who knew the truth understood that the shadow of Cell 13 had made the institution's continued operation impossible. The building was demolished in 1935, but Margaret's hidden copies of Blackmoor's journal eventually surfaced, providing historians with a chilling glimpse into the dark intersection of medicine, money, and murder in 19th century America. This mystery shows us how easily authority can be corrupted when combined with society's willingness to dispose of inconvenient individuals. The whispers from Cell 13 weren't supernatural phenomena. They were the recorded cries of people whose only crime was standing in the way of others' ambitions. What do you think about this story? Do you believe Margaret made the right choice in trying to expose the truth? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this story and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, activate the bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. See you in the next video.